Hello and welcome to our special Worlds 2016 edition of the Patch Rundown. I'm your host, James Patterson, joined by NALCS caster and analyst Aiden Zirene Moon. We've got former mid laner and coach in William Scarra, and of course the coach of Unicorns of Love, Fabian Sheepy. How are we doing today?
I'm doing great.
You are.
It's been such a blast, like off camera with you guys, but I'm ready to talk about
There's a good
patch.
energy here, but now it's time to buckle down, get serious, and talk about some patch changes. Right, Sheepy?
I cannot wait for Scarra to put the brain on the table and say,
yeah, I'm excited to put my brain on the table, so to speak.
All right, well, let's get into it. As we all know, patches are hugely important to the state of the game, and we want you at home to have the best understanding of what our pro players are going to be dealing with on a competitive level when they get to the world stage. Now, of course, 6.18 was a minor patch in that nothing was hit too hard, mostly minor nerfs, nothing super game-changing. But we are also going to be talking about 6.17 and 6.16 as it relates to Worlds. So I kind of want to break through this lane by lane, go through some of the changes, and then see how that'll affect play at Worlds. So let's start in the top lane, and let's start with the champions that are currently strong in the meta, the ones that we most recently were aware of. Of course, we haven't seen teams play since about 6.15, so we're looking at champions like Echo, Gnar, Shen, that bunch. So how do we feel they were affected here with these kind of minor nerfs that came through in 6.18?
Yeah, just to start off the list, like right now the champions that are mostly played in top lane are like Gnar, Shen, GP, Echo, and all of them have been hit in some kind of form by a nerf, more or less. The biggest one definitely goes to GP. The ultimate got down super much. I think like 120 DPS level 1. And it just goes through the ranks. So I think this is the huge one we really have to look out. I think GP also lost HP, and that makes it really hard in some of those burst matchups because you're rushing the Trinity Force. So I think GP is the one that's kind of out.
Yeah, I was going to say, were those nerfs enough to take him out entirely, or do we feel like he'll still be playable?
He might still be playable in very, very specific farm lanes. Let's say he was really popular during the Shen matchup, because when people were thinking about Shen counter picks, it's like, well, Shen just farms. And well, Gameplay just wants to farm, so Gameplay can outscale. But outside of those lanes, like you're not gonna be able to blind Gameplay early. I think he's just gonna get destroyed by any kind of lane counter pick. And as well as that, I think the Shen nerfs were kind of big, and everyone else was like just fairly small. Like the Echo and the Gnar nerfs were kind of tiny. Like I'll probably still see both of them back. However, the Shen nerfs really kind of forced out his skirmish potential. And I think that champions that used to counterpick him will now counter him a lot more.
All right, so then let's talk about some of those counters. With Shen maybe being the second most nerf champion behind GP in the top lane, who do we see being viable now against the likes of Shen, or maybe is allowed back into the meta because of those nerfs?
I think Rumble was already kind of in the meta for some players. I think he's definitely back. I think Jace with the 0.4 bonus AD every time he swaps.
Used to be an AP ratio,
yeah,
now it's an AD
great.
ratio, so straight buff for him.
Really good top laner in that. I think we're probably going to see some Kennen as well, and maybe some Yasuo into some of these matchups like the Gnar.
Yasuo is a champion that was gaining popularity here at the end of the split competitively for that kind of Frozen Mallet, tanky build. Of course, Frozen Mallet was also hit on top of some Yasuo changes. So is this still a viable champion at all in the top lane?
I think that the nerfs were good. However, I don't think they're as impactful as most people think, because the bonus damage on his ulti now only affects crits.
Yes.
However, he still rushes PD in almost every matchup. Like at most, you'll get one of the pieces of Mallet and then go back toward PD rushing. And so I think that because you're given 60% crit on one item, he's still not going to be that bad, especially against tanks. And the main tank threat that he played against, which was Gnar, which he already counterpicks, and Shen, which got nerfed, they aren't that good anymore. So I think Yasuo might see some play. However, it might be more consistent for people to take other counterpick matchups, especially with the rise of Rumble, potentially Jace, potentially Kennen, potentially even Ryze. I think Ryze is really, really strong right now, and we'll see a lot of flex pick action in the top lane and the mid lane.
Oh, that's an interesting point. The fact that, of course, we can have now flexes introduced with Ryze, getting the increase on his rank 1 ultimate, so that the range there is at least usable. I mean, do we feel that the top lane is going to be more carry-oriented with things like Ryze and Jace coming back out?
I think so. I think the big one here is really for top lane that the diversity just got opened up. Okay. The difference is when you, as a coach, usually watch the patch, you have the buffs and the nerfs. For buffs, you really have to single out the only champions. But for nerfs, you really have to look at the whole aspect of top lane in this case. So yeah, I really like the patch before Worlds. It really opens up like the counter matchups, and they're really the strong top laners will shine, and I think we'll be able to outcarry.
That's what I want to focus in on now, is the individual players at Worlds. Given the fact that the top lane meta might be opening a little bit, or, for example, when we see a lot of nerfs, that leaves room for people to experiment with champions that were untouched to kind of make their way into the meta. Are there specific players in the top lane that we feel might benefit the most by the patches that have come through recently?
I think that, for example, Smep will have a good time. You know, I think he's hardworking and usually picks up the stuff relatively fast. Other teams that have strong top laners as well. Maybe Cloud9 is, it's very impactful.
I mean, I think it's integral that Impact's Gnar has not left the meta. Although nerfed, I think still viable, and that was one of the champions that we saw him just absolutely dominant on at the end of the NA season. So the fact that that champion is still available to him will be very big for Cloud9.
Yeah, and I also want to touch on Smeb again, because I feel like a lot of these champions are already champions he played. Rumble, Kennen, things like that are already up there. QV, same story. And then NMD on the other side of the spectrum, though. These champions, we nerfed a tier of champions that are really hard to dive from varying degrees, right? So now it's a much less safe top lane. We're seeing things in solo queue like the Cassiopeia top when I check the pros solo queue records and the Rise. They're just trying to be able to kill you. They're trying to be able to pressure you out of lane. And now we're seeing harder punishes, whereas before GP can kind of sit back, Shen can kind of sit back, and you paralyze the bottom lane from making any moves because you have that global pressure. So the game overall, and top lane specifically, will become more aggressive, in my opinion.
I think it's really important to note that a lot of the other regions don't have as strong top lane. You should just look at LCK, you look at the MVP awards, like Smeb wins it, and honestly, the top laners get a lot of respect in Korea. However, when you look at North America, what really stands out are typically the AD carries, the mid laners, and top lane gets kind of pushed to the wayside. It's not because there isn't talent there. However, there's a lot, I feel like, less talent relative in the region comparatively to other regions. And so this Worlds is going to be, I feel like, because you can counterpick so easily, the top laner is going to be in a lot of pressure to be able to perform well every game.
All right, we've just been through a lot of information, but I am going to put you guys on the spot and ask you to create a tier list of champions for the top lane at Worlds this year. Zirene, let's start with you.
So for S tier, these are things I consider blind pickable, and that you would take them first pick. I think Gnar and Echo are still S tier. I think Rumble might actually jump up there as well to that S tier. And after that, it's a lot of counter picks. It's a lot of things like, is Jace going to be viable? Is Cassiopeia going to be going to the top lane? Because I would blind pick that and then flex it sometimes, just like Rise.
Okay, that's fair. Scarra, thoughts?
For me, I don't know necessarily if I value Echo as highly. I think it's just Gnar for everything, because he matches well against almost everything. He's blind pickable against anything that's not, I think, Yasuo. And even in the Yasuo matchup, it's possible to still farm it out and still be more relevant in team fights. Outside of, I think that's my only S tier. I have a lot of options available. I don't know how strong the current Rise is, but I suspect him and Rumble might be S tier, which is really interesting because they're both AP picks. And then the counter picks to that might arise as well. I think everything after the very top of the board starts being counter pickable. So it's a very, very open playing field here.
Okay, anything to add
I
there?
think it's just a common voice here for top lane. I think those are the blind picks, and afterwards it really becomes the counter.
Right. So the conclusion then is that the champion pool for top lane is widening, right? It's not that we're getting more narrow here going to Worlds. It's actually that there is a possibility of more champions being played than before.
And I think that if Gnar becomes a champion that is highly banned, then we see even more of that, and we see people save those last picks for their top lane.
All right. So then in the Worlds where we're seeing more champions played in top lane than we have previously, who is your sleeper pick? I'm going to ask you as the resident coach here, Sheepy.
Yes.
If you were going to Worlds, what would you be practicing right now in secrecy?
I honestly think that Kennen is the strongest. It's not a sleeper pick, but I honestly, I've seen it in action. I know you can get super far ahead, so it's got to be Kennen. And also, we're gonna talk later on about the jungle.
Yes,
and I think if there's more aggressive play, then Kennen just gonna snowball so hard over top lane.
All right, well, before we do get to the jungle, I want to talk about Cled as well and just kind of finish up the top lane talking about our newest addition to the top lane in Cled. Yorick is disabled for Worlds. Cled will be enabled. will teams, one, have had enough time to practice with him? Two, is he even a champion that you want to be bringing into the meta right now? Is he strong enough to play up there? Does he have a place? What are our thoughts?
I think he has a place in like an incredibly snowbally environment. I know some pros are playing it in solo queue, and I think the one that would bring it out that's most likely for me is iMei's top laner, Amazing J. He's been playing it in solo queue. He's a Garen guy, like he's known for that. So he has those oddball picks that sometimes he brings them out. But I definitely think that that's something he could take over the top lane with the new builds like Titanic Hydra, and people are building Hex Drinker, and a lot of those AP matchups.
Yeah, you were talking about AP matchups, Rumble and Ryze, maybe, you know, rising in priority, pardon the pun, but would, for example, Cled built in a manner like that be viable against those kind of champions as they move up in priority?
I've actually played a decent amount of Cled. I think the first week that Cled came out, I played only Cled. So I feel like I understand the champion a little bit more than most people. He tends to take advantage of low range, low mobility threats.
Okay.
So if you can E in and hit the Q, they should be dead, or they should be low enough to where it's not too much of a contest. I think in terms of pure 1v1 laning, he's not very good.
Okay.
Because you can disjoint his, or you can just break the second part of his Q so easily, and you can't stay on people as easily without someone else helping you, and before you get items. However, if it does turn into something like, oh, well, Rumble gets first pick, Ryze gets first pick, and then you have Cled plus X being the jungler that camps the lane, then there's really nothing Rumble can do if he gets E'd on and Q'd, if he doesn't have Flash. Even if he does have Flash, he could still die. And so, it might see play. However, at least in solo queue, I've seen that a lot of people need Ignite to be able to really push over the damage to actually pressure the enemy laner. However, in competitive play, you're going to see a lot more TP, and because of that, I don't necessarily think he's going to see as much play as you would expect.
There might be a space, but he's definitely not going to be 100% pick ban. For even more in-depth discussion on the Worlds patch, check out the links below.